Hello, I'm Maxine from Central Swindon North Parish Council Community Libraries, and I work as a library assistant at Even Swindon Library. But today I'm here in my kitchen to talk to you about what's been called the greatest novel of the 20th century, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Harper Lee grew up in the 1930s in Monroeville, Alabama, at a time of great social inequality, not just between the rich and poor, but between the black and white races. Black people were disenfranchised. Literally, they were legally entitled to vote, but the voter registration process was so complicated and you had to jump through so many hoops that very few black people actually got to exercise their vote. They were poor, they had the worst jobs, they were poorly paid, their schools were badly funded, their teachers were not as qualified, and they had very few rights. They couldn't ride in the front of the bus, couldn't eat at lunch counter, had different, separate fountains, separate benches, separate everything. And also there were terrible atrocities going on, such as beatings and lynchings, hangings, and none of these murders were punished. And To Kill a Mockingbird was written in the 1950s, published in 1960, which was also a time of great social unrest because people were challenging these conditions. It was the time of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, etc., the bus boycotts, garbage men strike, that sort of thing. And it was against this background that the book was written. In 1955, there was a murder of a young man called Emmett Till because he'd spoken to a white woman, and that murder went unpunished, even though everybody knew who had done it. So it's a kind of echo of the 1930s, and I think you've got to view To Kill a Mockingbird in that way. Harper's father was a lawyer in Monroeville, and in the book, which is set in a fictionalised version of Monroeville called Maycomb, the central characters are Atticus Finch, who is a lawyer, and his children, Jean Louise, known as Scout, and her brother Jem, who are being brought up by Atticus, who is a widower, with the assistance of a black maid known as Calpurnia, who takes the role of their mother. Atticus is given the job of defending a black man who's accused of attacking a white woman, which anybody with any sense knows was motivated by bad feelings on her part because he rejected her. But equally, everybody knows that he will be convicted because that's just how things are. And Atticus believes he deserves a defence, that justice should be served as much as possible. And it's against this background that the story unfolds. It's told from the viewpoint of Scout, and that enables you to look at racism and the events of the novel through a child's eyes with a sort of certain level of innocence. Racism is senseless to her, people are people, and it kind of, enables you to see it in a different light. There's a scene where Atticus is told that a lynch mob is coming to the jail where Tom's being kept, so he takes his rifle and he sits outside all night, mainly to defend him. And when the mob comes along, there's a sort of standoff, and then Jean Louise and her friends come along, her brother and the little boy next door called Dill, and they start talking to the men and asking them about their children and how's their sick wife and that sort of thing. And it humanises the men, and they look at their behaviour and they're ashamed. And they go home and Tom is saved. The viewpoint of a child also enables you to kind of look at the events in a sort of slightly removed kind of way. When you're a child, there are known things like school and discipline and meal times and all that sort of thing, but there's also a sort of world that you create for yourself by making sense of things, and that world might be sort of fairy tale or slightly ethereal. For example, there's a part of the book where a neighbour who has learning difficulties leaves in a hollow tree in their garden little trinkets and sculptures and things that he's made for them. And because they don't know that simple explanation, they make up stories about who's left them there. Is it pixies? So the novel has that kind of tone to it, that sort of once removed from real life quality that you live as a child. It is funny, it's moving, it has real pathos, sadness. It's very realistic. It is a quite extraordinary novel. Harper Lee worked as an airline worker in New York while she was trying to write, and life got in the way, and she submitted a few short stories, but she couldn't finish her novel. So one year some rich friends gave her the gift of a year's salary and told her to write the book, and this is the result. She never wrote another book, though I will come back to that later. She was a great friend of Truman Capote, who wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. In fact, she was his research assistant on Cold Blood, which is about a murder in Kansas of a family called the Clutters. And the killers believed they had £10,000 in their safe. There was no safe, there was no money, and they were murdered. Almost immediately caught, and Truman Capote wrote the book about them. It's his great masterpiece. Over a very long period of years, which he couldn't finish it until they actually were executed, and as I say, Harper was his research assistant on that. The two of them were childhood friends. The character of Dill in the novel is based on Truman Capote. And say she never wrote another book. She said she had nothing else to say. But in 2015, I think, a book was discovered called Go Set a Watchman, which was considered a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, and that was published, and upset a lot of people because the portrayal of Atticus in that is rather different. He's not such a clear-cut hero. His attitudes to racism are not as heroic and honourable as they seem in the book. However, it's pretty clear, I think, that it is the first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. It's not as accomplished. It has a slightly different format. It begins in the present day of the times, 1960, as Jean Louise is going back to visit her father in Macomb after the death of her brother, and then we get the To Kill a Mockingbird bit as a sort of flashback, and then we get to the present day again. As I say, it's a flawed first draft in my opinion, and not a patch on the original. It has been called, as I mentioned before, the greatest novel of the 20th century, and I'm not going to argue with that. It's a very fine book. It's an extraordinary book, and I don't think I've done it justice here. And I hope you enjoyed listening to me. Thank you very much.